Who are college basketball's biggest surprise teams and biggest disappointments as we get into the Feast Week festivities? Former head coach and college basketball analyst Matt McCall joins us to discuss that on the Locked On College Basketball Podcast.
You are Locked On College Basketball, part of the Locked On Podcast Network. Your team every day.
What's up, folks? Happy Friday. Happy Feast Week. Welcome into the Locked On College Basketball Podcast, part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day. I'm your host, Andy Patton. Today's episode of Locked On College Basketball is brought to you by PrizePicks. So go to prizepicks.com/LockedOnCollege. Use that promo code LockedOnCollege, and you'll get a first deposit match of up to $100. PrizePicks is daily fantasy sports made easy. Well, folks, very excited to be joined today by Matt McCall, former head coach at UMass and current college basketball broadcaster, here to discuss some of the biggest surprises, disappointments of the first few weeks of the 2023-24 college basketball season. We're also going to discuss some stuff going on in the Atlantic 10 Conference, some injuries to Dayton, some strong performances from teams like St. Bonaventure. What does it all mean for that conference? We'll get into that later. But, Matt, I want to start with kind of the biggest surprises. There's been some obvious teams that have lost games that we weren't expecting them to lose. Michigan State got a ton of attention for their early season loss to a now ranked James Madison squad. Who are some teams? And we'll start positive. We'll start with some teams that maybe have surpassed expectations, again, with the caveat that we're 11 days into the college basketball season. Who are some teams who have stood out of like, hey, this team might be better than we thought they were going to be coming into the year?
Andy, I think you hit the nail on the head just in terms of it's early, and we're really essentially only on week 2, week 3-ish in this season. As we go into the weekend and go into Feast Week next week, I think what Michigan doing without their head coach is extremely impressive. What they did in the Garden for Rick Pitino's, not his first game in the Garden, but his first game in the Garden for St. John's, to go in there. The place was packed. Everyone was excited for Pitino's debut, and they just handled business. I mean, the transfer from Tennessee, Olivia Cumwa, has been outstanding. Doug McDaniel, and we know Phil Martelli has coached a lot of games. He's been a head coach in a lot of games, but there's still, something pretty emotional about playing with your head coach. And, Martelli's done an unbelievable job. Their whole staff has done an unbelievable job of just keeping that team focused as they've gone through this transition without Coach Howard. Yeah, we got to hope Coach Howard gets back out there soon. We hope his health is okay. College coaching is a stressful business, and we all got to make sure that when you're in it, you're taking care of yourself. My wife would remind me that all the time, and it seems like every year I would lose about 15 pounds and get down and get really sick at the end of the year because of the stress. But I just think it's just super impressive. Yeah. It shows you how strong their culture is, and the fact that they're able to essentially not miss a beat without their head coach being out there.
Yeah, the ability of Michigan to, they lost Hunter Dickinson, of course, over the offseason. They lost 2 players to the draft, Jet Howard and Kobe Buffkin. They don't have their head coach, and they go out and beat a good St. John's team that, still has – I think that St. John's team is going to be better in February than they were right now just because of all the new pieces, but that's still an incredibly impressive victory. Doug McDaniel looks like an absolute dude for that team. You mentioned Kamala. He's been excellent as well, and that was the team that I was thinking about mentioning. I did have a backup plan in case you talked about Michigan there. I wanted to quickly shout out the Cougars of BYU, who've had a really successful season. Nice win over San Diego State. Really, really tough to win games in the Marriott Center, and San Diego State kind of already knew that, but went in there anyway and took a loss. And BYU, a team that I thought was going to really struggle coming into the Big 12, and we'll see where they shake out when it's all said and done. I still think there's a lot of really good teams ahead of them in the Big 12, but a really impressive start so far for Mark Pope and the Cougars out of BYU.
Yeah, no question. And I think you got to mention James Madison, Mark Bynes, and what he's doing. They had the huge win versus Michigan State. And a lot of times when that happens, you always have the fear as a head coach of your team having a letdown. Yeah. My first year as a head coach, our first game, we go on the road and beat Georgia 92-90 in overtime. And, we're coming back and playing a non-D1, but the fear of, man, how are we going to handle this next game? Same thing, same year. We go on the road. We beat Dayton at Dayton after losing Casey Jones, who was leading us in points, rebounds, and assists. follow that game up with Tennessee Tech at home, and you're sitting there saying, man, Tennessee Tech's got some really good guards. How are we going to handle this? That fear of that next game after a big win, and James Madison has just handled business. So, you know, credit Mark Byington, his team, his staff. Been super impressive to watch them.
I think Michigan State and Kent State are probably the two toughest teams that team's going to play all year, and to get victories in both those matchups, especially this early in the year, is huge testament to what James Madison has been able to do. Coach, I want to switch. Sorry, what were you saying?
No, I said no question about it.
Oh, gotcha. I want to switch over and talk about maybe some teams that haven't quite lived up to the expectations. Again, same caveat, 2 weeks into the season, if that. So I understandably that, especially in this era of the transfer portal, that some teams are just still trying to put all the pieces together, figure out where things are fitting and how some guys are gonna match up. There have been some teams that one thing I noticed is that basically every school on the actual West Coast who was ranked to start the season has taken an L except for Gonzaga. San Diego State, of course, we talked about their loss to BYU. USC just took that loss to Irvine. They're not at full strength right now, but still a tough loss for them there. And then, of course, St. Mary's with that disappointing loss to Weber State coming off of a nice win over New Mexico. So I'm sure there are some non-West Coast teams who have struggled early in the year as well. Is there anybody that kind of stands out to you, or is it kind of a situation of, hey, it's too early to make any big judgments right now?
I think it's too early to make any big judgments. I think, you know, looking at the Big Ten as a whole, you know, I think they are one of the best leagues in the country. Yeah. I was in studio the other night covering them for Peacock and NBC, and was actually at Big Ten Media Day for SiriusXM. I think that league, when we look at the league and we get to January and February, I think a lot of those teams are going to improve and get better. Tennessee goes into Wisconsin. Yeah. Nobody really knows who this Dalton Connect guy is, and he just was outstanding. I mean, I thought the guy played like one of the best players in the country in that game. You know, Ohio State gets Texas A&M on their home floor. Great game, close game. Wade Taylor kind of takes over in the second half. Both Wisconsin and Ohio State, you know, I'm trying to make this point. You know, they've got second-year guards. Yeah. They don't have fourth, fifth, sixth-year guards. They got second-year guards and guards who are going to get better as the season progresses. You just have to give them a little bit of time. You know, Maryland going 0-2 in Asheville, I don't think anybody really saw that coming. Credit Davidson, credit UAB for getting those wins. But I just look at the Big Ten right now. I think Purdue's the best team in the country. I think it's Kansas and Purdue right now, those two. But the league will get better. And when these teams start playing each other in the league, I still think the Big Ten could get multiple teams in the second weekend of the NCAA tournament. It's just really early right now, and surprising to say the least that they've lost some of these games in the non-conference this early in the season. You know, I thought the other night that one of those teams would knock off the SEC school, but you got to give the SEC school credit. I mean, you really do, you know. So that's been a little bit of a surprise to me because I do think it's one of the best leagues in the country.
Dayton lost Malachi Smith for the year, but did just pick up a huge win over the LSU Tigers on Thursday. Are they still the favorites in the Atlantic 10 Conference? We're going to discuss that after a word from today's sponsor, Prize Picks. Folks, Prize Picks offers weekly promotions that can lead to big payouts, like their Taco Tuesday deal. Every Tuesday, Prize Picks discounts select player projections up to 25% to provide you with even more value. And with the Prize Picks reboot policy, your entries stay in play even if one of your players gets injured. So for NFL or top 25 college football matchups, if you have a player who gets injured in the first half and does not return in the second half, that player is rebooted. Folks, Prize Picks is the only daily fantasy sports platform with injury insurance. This is unprecedented in the DFS space. And folks, this app is just super easy to use. All you do is pick two or more players and choose more or less with whatever given stat they have. Right now, you got Justin Moore over under 16.5 points in Villanova's game against Maryland. Look, Justin Moore just dropped 25 points. I'm taking the over here against the Terps. That is easy money. So go to prizepicks.com/lockedoncollege. Use promo code lockedoncollege for a first deposit match of up to $100. Again, that's prizepicks.com/lockedoncollege. Use that promo code lockedoncollege for a first deposit match of up to $100. Prize Picks, daily fantasy sports made easy. All right, folks, going to be joined again by Matt McCall to talk about the Atlantic 10 Conference. I want to thank all of you for making Locked On College Basketball your first listen or your first watch of the day, and remind you that Locked On has launched the first ever national sports 24/7 streaming channel on YouTube. Locked On Sports Today is here for you 24/7, covering the top stories of the day with local experts of Locked On, plus our national shows covering every single league, including Locked On College Basketball. So go to Locked On Sports Today on YouTube and subscribe for your first ever national sports 24/7 streaming channel. Yeah, I'm glad you mentioned Davidson and that win over Maryland, because I kind of want to transition into talking a bit more about the A-10 in general, a conference that I've been really intrigued by in the early going. And full disclosure for those listening, we were planning to talk a couple days ago and ended up getting this conversation pushed. And that actually changed a lot of the elements of the conversation about the A-10, because at that point, Dayton had not gotten that victory over LSU that they just secured, and St. Bonaventure didn't get that nice win over Oklahoma State that they much needed. So A-10's looking a little bit better than they were a few days ago, when there was kind of some concern about, hey, there's a lot of teams in this league that aren't really performing at the level we expected them to. But Matt, I do still want to start with Dayton, who obviously lost guard Malachi Smith to a season-ending injury, an unfortunate reality for Smith that this is now the second year in a row that's been severely impacted by injuries. He also missed parts of the end of his freshman year as well, and an incredibly talented player, one of the best freshmen in the entire conference a couple years ago. And now Dayton's going to be without him again. Deron Holmes has looked good. He did not look great in that game against LSU, but the team was still able to secure a victory over an SEC team. And I guess my main question to you is, with Malachi Smith's injury, with a couple other teams in the A-10 playing well at the start of the year, do you still have the Flyers as your favorite to win this conference, or do you think it's a bit more open now with Smith out?
One, it's just so unfortunate what happened with Malachi my last year at UMass. Dayton was really a win away from the NCAA tournament. I mean, if you go back to that season, they lose late in the season at LaSalle in Tom Gola Arena, and essentially that loss, I think, knocked them out of the tournament. Had they not lost that game, they would have had a chance to get an at-large bid, and a large part of that was because of the play of Malachi Smith. I mean, he was, for a freshman to do what he did that season, it's just really unfortunate, because he's a terrific player. He's an even better human being. So there's an adjustment period that Dayton is going through. And I thought at times they looked really good versus Northwestern. They found themselves down in that game, but they fought back. They had chances late in the game to pull that one out. The ball just didn't go down. And, last night the ball went down. And I was on the field of 68 last night, and we actually had Nate Santos on, and we were talking to him. And the play kind of got broken down. The last play of the game, it's called a rip screen. We used to run them at Florida when Coach Grant was there as an assistant coach, and I was on staff. And essentially it's a fake drive to the baseline, and you're bringing a guard off two staggers. You want the defense to think that this is a play to go to the basket, and you pitch it back for a three-point shot. Well, I think the three-point shot was supposed to be for Kobe Brea, and Santos kind of sees that the play is breaking down, so he just pops to the perimeter and almost caught those guys off guard a little bit, and LSU gets a wide-open shot and knocks it down. But to answer your question, I think the league's wide open. I think Dayton will be there. St. Bonaventure did drop one to Canisius. Credit my man Reggie Witherspoon, one of the greatest human beings in all of college basketball, was with me at Chattanooga. Big win for him, but they responded. I think the depth of St. Bonaventure, the guard play is outstanding. What Schmidt did in the transfer portal, adding Mika Adams-Woods and Charles Pride, again, there's going to take an adjustment. I mean, Kyrell Luke is used to being the starting point guard on that team. How does he adjust to coming off the bench, being a former, Patriot League Freshman of the Year? There's adjustments that all these players and teams have to go through, especially early in the year. So I think it's a wide open league. I really do. Davidson, what they did down in Asheville, they looked really good. If you lose Foster Lawyer, to think that they're going to go out there and beat Maryland in that event. I think that the league is as good as it's been. And once we get to league play, it's going to be some exciting matchups. I mean, there's no off nights. We were talking about this on the A-10 Insider podcast. When you look at the preseason standings, and I've said this a couple different times, you look at the preseason standings in the Atlantic 10, and you look at the bottom four teams. Just look at the coaches in the league of the bottom 4 teams. Frank Martin at UMass is the only person to ever take South Carolina to a Final Four. Archie Miller at Rhode Island has won a gazillion Atlantic 10 games, took Dayton to the Elite 8. Was in the tournament every single year when he was at Dayton. Okay. Chris Mooney's one of the best coaches in the league. Extremely difficult to prepare for. And oh, by the way, you've got a living legend at LaSalle coaching that team who they're going to win games. I've said it before. I don't think LaSalle finishes last in the league this year because they've got good guard play and they have a really, really good coach in Coach Dunn. So, you know, that's how good the league is. And there's no off nights, and you've got to prepare and you've got to bring it every single night. We haven't even mentioned St. Joe's and maybe the best guard in the league. So, you know, it's going to be fun to watch. It's going to be a lot of fun to cover. And, you know, I'm essentially in studio every single Saturday for NBC, and all the games are on USA Network. So looking forward to watching some good hoops.
Yeah, A-10 seems like an absolute blast this year. And I think, you know, a lot of people will see, oh, it's Dayton or VCU and kind of maybe not pay a lot of attention to the rest of the teams. But like you said, I mean, St. Bonaventure, the Pride and Adams-Woods just look absolutely incredible in that backcourt. And you know, Pride had been the guy who really stepped up in the first couple of games. And then Adams-Woods has this really monster game against Oklahoma State and a really needed victory for the Bonnies. So you're just seeing teams that have the ability to have multiple guys step up. And I do want to talk a little bit about VCU because I think, again, knowing that it's early in the year, they haven't quite looked up to where we expected them to be with new coach Ryan Odom. Again, a very new roster. Max Shulga, who comes over from Utah State alongside Odom, he looks very good. Team struggled a little bit, and they had that season opening loss to McNeese, who I think is probably a better team than a lot of people may realize they are over there. They needed a big second half to get that win over Samford, but I suspect VCU is going to end up being a lot better when they get into league play than they have been early in the year. But I'm curious for what you've seen out of that team so far, and if you think there's still going to be a team that's kind of really competing at the top with those other squads.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's a new coach, it's a new system, it's a new style, to be honest with you, too, in terms of VCU. And you know, they kind of broke away from the Shaka Smart family, where you know, defense is the mentality. That's how they're going to play. You know, in passing lanes, athleticism, outrunning, jumping, pressing. Those types of things. There's new leadership, and kind of broke away from, you know, that mentality as a team. So, you know, I think you just got to give Coach Odom some time. Look, he's a terrific coach. He's the right guy for the job. He's won everywhere he's been. He's back in his state where, you know, he had one of the greatest upsets in the history of the NCAA tournament. So you just got to give them time, his players time to adjust to a new system. This is not, you know, something that maybe they're used to, maybe that VCU fans aren't used to, but he's an outstanding coach. They're going to be fine. You know, again, just got to give them a little bit of time to adjust to how they're going to play.
Want to talk about Davidson a little bit more as well. I know that's a team that you mentioned there, a team that didn't have super high expectations coming into the year, but they have that win over Maryland. Of course, we talked about how that has something to do with Maryland just still trying to find themselves early in the year, but a really quality win for a Wildcats team that has a really balanced scoring attack so far in the year. They're shooting well from deep. They're not turning the ball over. Like, this is a program that has looked really good in their first couple of games this year. Narrow loss to Clemson as well. And you know, a team that hasn't gotten a lot of attention nationally since, of course, Steph Curry was there a while back, but a team that has been consistently good for a really long time, and looks like they might be, you know, primed to exceed expectations coming into this season. Let's put it that way.
Yeah, I think you threw out the term balance, and I think that's the biggest key for Davidson. It's a difficult style to play against when, you know, the floor is spaced. You got 5 guys out there on the floor that can shoot it. It makes it very difficult to guard. They're one of the more physical teams in the Atlantic 10. They take a lot of pride in screening, setting screens, being physical. They've always done that in either McKillop era. And you know, when you have a player, you know, of Foster Lawyer's capabilities, the ball is in his hands so much for him to create that sometimes, I don't want to say it's addition by subtraction, because you can't with what he did in the Atlantic 10. That's not the right term to use. But when you don't have him anymore, and he's not the guy that has the ball in his hands in the high pick and roll with the game on the line throughout the course of the game, you tend to have more ball movement, player movement, and the ball hops around a little bit more. And I think that's what you see with Davidson right now. And hard team to guard, physical team. You know they're going to defend. You know they're going to set screens. And, you know, when you have 1 or 2 nights to prepare, that makes this challenging. Hey, man, we're preparing on Monday or Wednesday night for Richmond. We're guarding Princeton. Now all of a sudden we got to turn around and play against this motion. We got to fight through screens. We've got to do this. So I think that's another thing that just makes this league so good.
Got a lot of great A-10 games coming up on Friday here as we're recording this on Friday morning. Of course, Dayton playing St. John's. That's at 2 p.m. Eastern time. You got St. Bonaventure playing Auburn at 7 p.m. Eastern time. Davidson's going to take on East Tennessee State also at 7 p.m. Lots of fantastic games. Of course, more games coming up next week as well. Matt McCall, thank you so much for joining us today. A-10 Insider Podcast, Field of 68. Thank you so much for coming on. We really appreciate your expertise and insight here on Locked On College Basketball.
And anytime, man. Happy to do it.
All right, folks. Thank you to Matt McCall for joining us today. We are going to close out the show with our second ever FanDuel Friday, taking a look at some of the lines on the biggest games over the start of Feast Week. But first, I want to tell you about today's sponsor, Athletic Brewing, and our game changer of the week, brought to you by the Athletic Brewing Company. Much like how Mika Adams-Woods changed the game in the entire Legends Classic for St. Bonaventure, Athletic Brewing Company has completely changed the non-alcoholic beer game. They make non-alcoholic beers that actually taste good, full flavor, and well-crafted, just like a full-strength beer. Meanwhile, Adams-Woods had 17 points for the Bonnies in a 2-point win over Oklahoma State. Massive victory in that Legends Classic. Athletic Brewing has over 50 styles of craft non-alcoholic beer, including IPAs, golden, sours, and more. And the brews are fit for all times. You can drink them anytime, anywhere, and make any activity more enjoyable, including watching all of the big games over this weekend and next week into Feast Week. You can find Athletic Brewing Company's non-alcoholic brews at a store near you or buy them online at athleticbrewing.com. First-time customers can use promo code LOCKEDON to get 15% off your first online order. That's code LOCKEDON at checkout for 15% off at athleticbrewing.com. Exclusions and conditions apply. Athletic Brewing Company, fit for all times. All right, folks, close another show and the week like we did last week, like we plan to do here throughout the season on the Locked On College Basketball Podcast with what we're calling FanDuel Friday. We're going to pick 5 different lines, betting odds, spreads from our partners over at FanDuel and discuss them here on the podcast for upcoming games. Today, all of the lines we picked today are for Friday's games, so definitely get over to FanDuel.com and put these in if you are so inclined. Last week was our first week. Went 2-3 last week, so not a fantastic start. We'll happily admit that here, but hopefully some better luck ahead with the picks here this week, starting with a game between Miami and Georgia taking place in the Bahamas. This game takes place Friday at 3:15 p.m. Eastern time. It is a Miami versus Georgia game. The spread is Miami by 6.5 points, which has got -102 odds, and I'm hitting the spread on this one. Right now, KenPom has Miami 44th in the country, Georgia down at 70th, and the Canes haven't been getting a ton of love here on the podcast. They haven't gotten a ton of love in KenPom's rankings yet, just not quite enthused about where this team is at right now. They haven't been super tested, but frankly, Georgia, I'm not a big believer in the Bulldogs just yet. They lost to Oregon in the first game of the year. I understand losing to Oregon in that game. Oregon's a decent team, but I don't think Oregon's a particularly great team. This team also has a narrow 3-point victory over a Wake Forest team that frankly hasn't looked all that good either. They also have a 10-point victory over NC Central. Meanwhile, the Canes are shooting the absolute crap out of the basketball right now, 50% from deep. They've scored 92 points per game on average. Again, yes, the quality of competition for Miami. They haven't faced a team even as good as Georgia, but Georgia has not faced a team as good as Miami. I think Miami is better than the Ducks. And to me, while Georgia is a roughly top 50 team defensively at KenPom, I think as of this recording, they're 52nd in the country. The combination of Wooga Poplar and the Nigel Pack and the rest of that fantastic Matthew Cleveland, great addition from Florida State. I just think this Miami team is too overwhelmingly good and talented to not win this game by more than 7 points. So give me the spread there for the Canes. Number 2 here, we got a fun matchup between a Big 12 team and a Big East team in Kansas State and Providence. I'm taking the money line on the Friars here for Providence. That's +104 odds. This game is also part of that Bahamas tournament in the Bahamas. The game will take place at 6 p.m. Eastern time on Friday. And yeah, there's no Naquan Tomlin, for Jerome Tang and the Wildcats. Providence handled a solid Wisconsin squad by 10 points. They won that game. I think Kim English is doing a really good job. I like what Bryce Hopkins, of course, is continuing to do for that team. Devin Carter as well. Kansas State, I think, is a good team. I think they're going to finish the season as a quality team. Arthur Kaluma has looked solid. Tyler Perry has looked good in spurts, but to me, I think Providence wins this one. The spread was very close. I think it was 1.5. So for me, I'd rather take the money line here. It's plus 104 odds. I really think Providence comes out of this one with a victory. Number 3, back with some East Coast opponents here. This game's at Friday at 7 p.m. Eastern time. It is a fun battle between Florida and Florida State. Epic rivalry there. I'm taking the spread for Florida in this one. That's 120 odds for them. Florida State hasn't been tested yet. They have blowout wins over both Central Michigan and Kennesaw State. I think they won both those games by the same score. It was huge blowout games for them. Meanwhile, Florida has at least been tested. They lost to Virginia, very close game against the Cavs, a game I thought they had a chance to win. I think it was a 3-point game overall, but Florida's at home. I think they can cover the spread at home. Todd Golden has a phenomenal team here. We've seen some really good stuff from Riley Kugel. Walter Clayton Jr., I think, has to step up a little bit more than he has. He's been a little inconsistent so far, transferring up from Iona to play for the Gators. Florida State has turnover issues. They've turned the ball over a bunch, even against weaker teams like Central Michigan and Kennesaw State. I think Florida can exploit that, get the Noles out into turnover issues, and go ahead and secure themselves a victory. 2 more spreads here to talk about before we close out the show and the week leading into Feast Week and the really fun games that are taking place next week. Number 4, in the Continental Tire main event, San Diego State versus St. Mary's. Isaac and I, my co-host, discussed the frustration and how this tournament is seeded. San Diego State and St. Mary's should not be playing each other in the first round when the other round game is Xavier and Washington. We'll talk about that game here in just a second. St. Mary's and San Diego State is at 9 p.m. Eastern time on Friday. I'm taking the under for total points in this game, which is 131.5. That's negative 110 odds on that bet. This is 2 top 30 defenses in the country. St. Mary's is currently ranked 27th. They are a better defense than 27th in my mind. They just got dropped a little bit by that frustrating loss to Weber State. San Diego State is 12th defensively, and even though they lost to BYU, I think we are probably underrating BYU. That's something we may talk about going into next week. And B, I still think San Diego State played a good game defensively. Their offense just didn't show up, and I think that kind of helps lead into the point. Neither San Diego State or St. Mary's have had their offense really show up yet. St. Mary's played well offensively against New Mexico. They did not play well offensively against Weber State. San Diego State did not play well offensively against BYU. Now these 2 teams match up against each other, struggling offensively, 2 top 30 defenses. Tempo-wise, San Diego State does play at a more advanced tempo. They're 112th in the country at adjusted tempo. According to KenPom, St. Mary's is 348th, which is about where they like to reside. That's where Randy Bennett wants that team, is playing slow and slow and slow as they can. And I think the combination of the speed of this game, 2 struggling offenses matching up together, 2 top 30 defenses, it's hard for me to see this game not being something like 55-50 or maybe even like 58-53 or something like that. Either way, all those scores are under that 131.5 spread right now. So give me the under on that, negative 110 odds. I'm smashing that one and expecting to see a low scoring affair there between those 2 teams. And then the final one, the second game of that Continental Tire main event, Xavier versus Washington, a matchup that, again, should be split with San Diego State and St. Mary's. I'm taking the spread for Xavier. They're 2.5-point favorites right now. That's 110 odds for them. And I feel pretty confident about this one. Washington has not looked good. They lost to Nevada. They have not played well in their other games. They're disjointed offensively. To be clear, this game is taking place at basically midnight on the East Coast on Friday evening. It is also part of that Continental Tire main event. And Xavier is 38th in KenPom right now. Washington is 75th. So for me, that's a big spread in KenPom. Xavier, the eye test is pretty clear. Washington has not looked good. They do have a decent front court, which could help them, especially with all the injuries impacting Xavier right now without Jerome Hunter, without Fremantle. They're really thin up front. Meanwhile, Washington has Frank Kepnang, the Oregon transfer who sat out last year with an injury, but he looks solid. Braxton Mia, Fresno State transfer, who looks very good as well. But I don't trust Washington to be able to run a cohesive enough offense to take advantage of those mismatches. Quite frankly, I don't think they're going to do themselves a lot of favor with the zone defense. I think Xavier is going to win this one. And quite frankly, I think they're going to win. If this was a 6.5 point spread, if this was an 8.5 point spread, to be honest, I'd at least think about it, but I still think I'd take Xavier. So at a 2.5 spread, absolutely taking the Musketeers and Sean Miller in this one. That to me is the most obvious one on this group in my mind. Let's hope here that we're going to go better than 2 and 3 like we did last week. That's going to wrap us up for today and for this week here on the Locked On College Basketball Podcast. Thank you so much for making the show your first listen or your first watch of the day. Stick with us getting into next week as we continue to preview Feast Week, review the Feast Week games, and talk all about the funnest week in college basketball that's not in the month of March, all coming up here on the Locked On College Basketball Podcast. Thank you so much for listening, and until next time, as always, peace out.